Everybody, welcome back to the Edge of Chaos. I am Joe Ryan, and I've actually managed to track down a possibly dangerous, somewhat risky refugee to have on the show, and you may know him as Neurotoxin.
Hello.
And I wanted to intro it that way because during this show, we're going to bust through some of the myths and some of the actual facts of being a refugee coming to this country. Since, most of the Republicans in general, presidential candidates, Trump, Cruz, don't seem to understand many things about how their own government that they purport to want to be in charge of, how it actually works. And
And I mean, Americans in general, not just the Republicans and not just politicians. So I really wanted to spend a little bit of time educating our listeners on refugees today because, I mean, a lot of the topics we talk about, we're both very frustrated with the widespread ignorance. But on this topic, people just really don't understand the difference between their ass and a hole in the ground. It's mind-boggling to me. So first of all, as Joe introduced, yes, I myself came to this country as a refugee from the USSR, from ethnic persecution. Not all refugees have to outrun machine guns to get here, but yeah, that's what a refugee is. So if you think refugees are scary and you're listening to my show, you're already contradicting yourself. Run away now. You're a fan of a refugee. So let's talk a little bit about refugees. My other experience with refugees is actually as a social worker working in social services. I've actually worked with quite a few resettled refugees from all over the world. Chaldeans from Iraq, various East African countries, Southeast Asia, other Eastern European refugees. We're everywhere, and we come in all colors. The refugees are not as uncommon in this country as some people think. The refugees from Syria currently have had this spotlight on them, but really we take several 100,000 a year, even without a crisis like this. Just first fact to throw out there. So some of the myths about refugees are some of the same myths about immigrants, and I've spent a lot of time just busting up myths about immigrants because a lot of them are so inaccurate. But about refugees, these become infinitely more inaccurate. So the first myth, of course, is that we're dangerous. Oh yeah, I'm coming to get you. You know, if I'm a refugee from ethnic persecution by the Soviet government, I must be a spy.
A secret communist waiting to overthrow, yeah.
Now, honestly, we've taken refugees. I mean, I'm not going to get into all the history behind our immigration policy, but the concept of refugees was probably introduced early 20th century when we still had open borders. This is probably the first time in our history that any enemy of the United States has even mentioned or purported to try to sneak in saboteurs or terrorists or spies via the refugee process. I realize Donald Trump won't shut up about it, but this is the first time this is actually documented to happen. You know, sometimes when somebody says something that does not necessarily become fact. And
it doesn't?
I know, right? Yeah.
Probably Fiorina thought it did. Anyway.
Well, yeah. So, exactly. So, the reason for that is very simple. This process is indeed very, very rigorous. It's not easy to get refugee status. First of all, the difference between a refugee and an immigrant on the domestic side is simply that as a refugee, you get a lot more help. It's not about crossing the border. That part is pretty similar. It's how much help you get once you get here. If you're a refugee, you get a ton of social service handouts at first because it's considered that you're not coming over here of your own volition. A lot of refugees spend time in camps. I didn't, but a lot of them do. So they've been out there in the middle of nowhere, living in the desert, whatever, in a UNESCO camp for several years. They don't really have anything. They come over here and they get a lot of kind of rapid resettlement help. Usually it's funneled through social service organizations. We'll get to that. So that's the big difference on the domestic side is what you get. So because, this country is not super generous with our social services, which I agree with completely, Joe may not, but I think that's a good thing. Refugees are very heavily vetted, not so much for being dangerous, just because they're going to get a lot of help, so the government wants to make sure that they really need it, just like they do with people domestically that get any kind of social handout. Whether or not you agree with that, that's fact. So for that reason, the vetting process for refugees is extremely rigorous. It's far more so than for legal immigrants, and it just does not provide a very low-cost way for another government to get its spies or saboteurs in. The reason it's happening now is because Daesh is so pathetic That this is the only way they could even get anyone in. That's actually shows that this enemy we're facing is a complete joke. And honestly, this is a different show, but I think there are threats to our security in the world, and Daesh is very, very low on the totem pole. They're just easy to point at because everyone agrees, oh yeah, those guys are assholes. But when you start talking about the Iranian government or the Russian government, all of a sudden you have people that are saying, no, Putin's manly and shit like that. Be that as it may. So that's one thing. This is the first time we've even documented, even in Europe, anyone getting it. However, it's not enough to say, well, look, there's 2 guys that allege they snuck in as refugees, or I guess there's one that's been proven now, that's actually a terrorist or a member of an enemy organization, therefore all refugees are dangerous now. If you think that, please just turn off the show because you're a moron. I mean, logically speaking, we have to look at numbers. We have to look at how many people, there's how many Syrian refugees coming now? Help me out here. 300,000, I believe?
No, we're only taking 20.
We're planning to take. That's it?
20.
Right. And out of those...
And you would think that each one of them has a suicide vest strapped to them. By the way, they were probably...
20,000
We're getting to that.
People in suicide vests. Well, we'd be running short on explosives in the country.
I have to correct myself. Canada is taking 20. We're taking 10.
That's it? No,
10.
I could have sworn it was more than that.
10.
But okay.
10,000.
10,000 is not even a drop in the bucket.
That's it.
We take more refugees than that monthly from other places.
Yeah.
Here's the thing. Here's my point with that, and then we'll move on. You have to look at things quantitatively and comparatively. If there are fewer criminals, because blowing yourself up in violent crime is still a crime, regardless of why you're doing it, what the ideology is. If there's less of a prevalence of that among refugees than there is among American citizens, and judging by the gentleman's behavior in Colorado Springs yesterday, you don't have to be a refugee to just go kill people for no apparent reason, then there's really nothing to worry about.
I saw someone like, violent white guy shoots something. Let's shut down his church. Let's drone strike his relatives. Well,
see, I don't think we should do that. I'm just saying that people need to pay attention. The domestic terrorism is a real thing, too. We can't just blame a certain group just abusing ignorance. That brings me to point number 2 about quantitative difference. And of course, the second point that people have an issue with immigrants and refugees, we already mentioned this, is social services and handouts. And again, welfare state abuse is a huge problem. And it is a problem among immigrants, although there is zero reason to believe it's more of a problem among immigrants than it is among U.S. citizens. Again, I'm not a big fan of social service handouts precisely because they're so easy to abuse, especially at the federal level. But if someone is abusing this, if they've been living in, subsidized housing for 50 years and they malinger with welfare and disability and they actually deal drugs on the side, yeah, all that's a problem. I don't want to be supporting that person. I really don't care if they have papers or not. How is that relevant, right? This is a classification that the government has invented that we now look at that as opposed to, okay, what is this person really doing? What are they actually contributing? Oh, well, do they have papers or not? Again, this is an easy way for the government to take responsibility off of themselves and put it on some outcast class that may or may not be able to vote for the shittiness of these programs. But even with that in mind, if you look at refugees, that number, that proportion of welfare state abuse goes down to almost zero. And I'm not just saying that from personal experience. Do the research on this, look this up. I went to social work school. It makes perfect sense. Refugees are exceptional people. I realize I'm tooting my own horn here. But if you think about it, these are people in most cases that outran machine guns to get here. If you think about how many people are coming over here from Syria or from Somalia a few years ago, most people that were there stayed there. It's not like the whole country came over here, right? So if they did that, if they braved those conditions to get here, they probably didn't do it so they could sit on welfare and live in affordable housing. These people are not representative to the extent that when we do any kind of research on populations, we are cautioned not to make assumptions about people from a certain region or a certain country by doing research on refugees. Any kind of sociological research on refugees, because they are so extremely unrepresentative of the place where they come from. So that's another one to keep in mind, that this is an accusation that's plain non-existent, and you see people citing immigrant numbers as if those are the same as refugee numbers, and they're not. Now, the third one I'm not going to touch because luckily I actually haven't seen a lot of this one, and that's assimilation. You get that a lot with immigrants, and I think we'll touch enough on that on the show that we don't need to worry about that. Now, let me present a little bit of the other side. That's kind of more just refugees in general. Social services, and this is where I think Joe and I are going to have the biggest disagreement or disagreement in general. And one thing I've been seeing that's really interesting and really ties into a lot of things that I've said on the show that Joe's rolled his eyes at, and that's the states that have been refusing to take refugees. So
including
now
my new state,
Texas. Well, of course.
That guy's an asshole. That wasn't a surprise.
He's a psycho. He's not an asshole. There's got to be an insane asylum somewhere that's missing.
This is the guy, by the way, if you guys don't know, the governor of Texas. As a really quick aside, he's the one who got multi-millions in a lawsuit for how he injured himself and put himself in a wheelchair and then capped those awards later for other people.
Yeah. Charming fella.
Yeah.
Anyway,
he got his, so yeah.
Yeah. So states refusing to take refugees. And like I said, I'm extremely for refugees. I think we should just open the borders and let people in. I mean, there's certain vetting processes that are necessary, but I think that our borders need to be a lot more open than they are. But let's face it, and this is more coming from me as a professional, the federal government really sucks at resettling these refugees. And if you think our government sucks at it, look at France, and that's going to make our federal government look like geniuses.
Yeah.
They come over here, and they basically get assigned a place to live, where you have these large apartment complexes that they all speak the same language. They're all from the same place. They're all being serviced in their needs by the same social service organization. They all get a handout, basically, for being there. And the cities where they are, usually it's not by state, it's by city. The city gets a certain amount of money per person that they take. But it's a joke. And the other thing is that sometimes there's multiple communities, like in multiple cities. So the refugees will move between communities, but they'll stay within their own community. But nobody keeps track of this, so the same city keeps getting money. The one they're moving to doesn't keep getting money. One thing that I should mention here in East County, San Diego, where I am, which is where we're recording the show today, here in the city of El Cajon, you have a huge population of Chaldean refugees from Iraq. Now, I won't get into the history of Chaldeans. You can look up that yourself. But I've actually spoken to the mayor of El Cajon about this. And there are about 3 times as many as he gets funding for. Because they were settled in 3 places: Detroit, Denver, and San Diego, California. Which of those 3 would you choose? And as far as what's the most similar to Baghdad? Well, in weather terms and in landscape.
You mean Detroit being 10 below in the winter? They're not used to that.
Well, Detroit sucks in every respect.
I guess the one thing in the pro column is, hey, I can get a whole house for $1,000. Yeah, but it's in the middle of Detroit.
You're gonna get shot. Well, I mean, for them, that's that's really nothing new, right?
Of course, Detroit, ISIS. That does beat it, not by a lot.
Daesh, Joe.
That's Daesh. True. Sorry.
And they're not in Baghdad. Daesh is not in Baghdad, which is where the Chaldeans come from, almost exclusively. In any case, long story short, the federal government does this. It settles them, and there is a documented number of problems as a result of resettled refugees. They don't last very long. It's not like they remain a problem. But when you first resettle them, you have a large community that's being settled into a place where there really hasn't been a lot of effective vetting for whether or not this is a good place to settle a new community. They're very poor. They use a lot of social services. They do a lot of cultural things that I realize, this is a country where we welcome new cultures, but they do a lot of things that make a lot of the people that live around them uncomfortable. And the solution is very simple. Do not put them all in one place. You want people to assimilate faster. Don't just block off 5 city blocks and put several 100,000 people there, right? Because that's how you create these little enclaves. And I mean, if you look at U.S. history, that's how it used to be, Little Italy, right? Chinatown. But these places, historically, the segregation has had very bad outcomes. You get gang wars between different ethnicities. They don't even speak the same language. There's no real way for them to get together. I mean, segregation is a bad thing. There's no question about it. And a lot of the segregation with refugees in the modern world, if you look at, immigrants don't even necessarily segregate themselves anymore. But with refugees, it's completely top down and done by the federal government. And of course, anything the federal government does, in a local sense, it has to run through the local government and the state government. The way they motivate people to take refugees, the locals in the state, is they give them money. This is what the federal government does. Well, here, you get this grant. Well, we're coming to an age in this country where it's becoming popular, look up Obamacare if you don't believe me, to refuse federal money and say, no, we don't want this, fuck you. And it's not like the money you get for refugees is not really that big of a deal. So this is a very easy way for Republican governors, even governors that are conservative Democrats, to say fuck you to Obama and earn easy brownie points with people in their states. Now again, I'm not against refugees, but this is what's going to happen. When you have a shitty federal government program that's underfunded, very poorly researched, very poorly implemented, and then it's shoved down the throats of the local and state governments, they're going to use it, and it's really not that big a deal for them. They're going to use it as a way to resist the federal government and resist federalism. And who does it fuck over? The refugees. So that's kind of, I think, both sides of it. I think that, honestly, I don't really believe we need a special refugee status, would be my outlook on this. We should let people in if they want to come in. Really, we need a vetting process, but one that's a lot less strenuous than the one we have now. Even that distinction between refugee and immigrant, in my opinion, it's great for research, but other than that, it's kind of not very useful. So there you go. That's just my little myth busting for a few minutes that we wanted to start with, and from there on, what do you think, Joe?
I know you like to shit on paid federal assistance and things like that, but I guess your idea to fill that void, and I think this is something you told me about being a thing with Russian refugees, is private organizations helping you and stuff when you get here. Because like you said, these are people that they don't have the choice of being takers, as Republicans would call them. Right?
Takers.
If you don't have the federal government ponying up the dough, who's going to do it? I guess it would be my own question, but that's just a policy question.
That's a good question. It's a very good question. And like I said, honestly, if anyone deserves the handouts in a purely financial sense, it's these refugees, because they actually fulfill the prophecy where, look, if we give these people a hand up, in 6 months, in a year, they're going to be productive members of society. If there's anyone that's true about, it's refugees. Because again,
a guy could have been a doctor where he came from. You don't know, right? It's it's not just somebody who just came here just to come here.
So, in fact, a lot of them are very educated, very middle class, they have a lot of skills that are useful. They're not random immigrants. Because again, these are exceptional people, a lot of religious leaders that get out of those countries. The refugees in any crisis make up maybe 1 to 2% of the population. So that's a huge thing. If anyone deserves to receive these benefits in a financial sense where it's actually a worthwhile investment, it's the refugees. The thing is, it's the way the federal government does it. I hate to say this, and Joe will disagree, but the federal government can't get anything right. And if you don't believe it, look at it and tell me if you really trust that behemoth to do anything. Come on.
I think that this may be it's one branch of the fucked up, weird-looking Halloween skeleton tree that is our immigration policy. That has all these different branches of fucked upitude that go off of it.
Now, here's my counter question to you on that, Joe. There might not have been a refugee status in the 19th century, but I feel like a lot more of the immigrants that came back then qualified for the definition of refugees that we have today.
Oh, Irish, that was definitely true.
Yeah, the potato famines and the persecution. Eastern Europeans, too. The
Italians,
Jews
for that matter, a lot of them were fleeing the frickin' mafia, weren't they?
Yes. Russians and Polish, people from the Russian Empire, late 19th century, Jews with the pogroms. Okay? Chinese and Japanese, let's not even get into what was going on over there in the 19th century, but if you don't know, you should probably read more.
I need to read more about that.
Well,
myself.
the rice famines and just and Japan, that was the start of Imperial Japan, was the late 19th century. And that shit, let's just say they lasted a little bit longer than Nazi Germany. So
I guess here's the thing. I don't know if you saw this. A lot of people were bringing up the thing. They don't teach you this shit in high school history. It's part of the reason why I went to a full 4-year college. Anyhow, about the ship full of Jewish refugees that was turned away. Did you hear about this? It was
I've
sent
read
back
about
to
that.
Belgium, and they got off, and half of them died. Or no, it was like half or three-quarters or something like that. Like they split up those people when they disembarked in Europe, and a bunch went to France, a bunch went to Amsterdam, and some went to Britain. Guess which ones didn't die? The Britain ones. I mean, and they came that close. So it's like, these are things that have happened before. We've gone like this to people, and people have died. So the fact that they and you know and of course it comes from MSNBC, so no one wants to hear it, even if it's true. You know, even if you hate them, they can be right sometimes.
Even a broken clock.
Fox News is right sometimes too.
Even a broken clock.
Right, yeah. So it's like, but they were sourcing quotes from these articles that were written back then people are afraid they're communist agitators or they're secretly
Something
Nazis
vaguely
or
familiar
German
about all
spies.
this.
It's like, seriously? We don't fucking remember. It wasn't even that long
Oh yeah, the
ago.
Jews during World War II were total German spies. So yeah, that's
Right.
totally the regime they'd work for. Here's the thing. Okay, where I was going
The
with
same
that.
idiotic shit is going on right now with Syria.
But here's my question to you, Joe, the counter question I want to ask. Who helped those people in the 19th century? There was no federal handout programs. There weren't even really, at the federal level, social service organizations that helped them. And like I said, a lot larger percentage of the immigrants in those times would have qualified for refugee status today. And there was no massive handout program to help them. They came over here and they struggled and they prospered. This is a country of refugees. I mean, the Puritans were refugees. This is actually, by the way, a real quick aside. Anytime someone wants to post about this on the religious paradigm,
oh boy,
Islam, it's the Muslims, they're Muslims, therefore, even though a lot of the immigrants from Syria are not Muslims, but we won't get into that. They're Islam, and Islam is evil, and they're going to take over the world. You understand, this country was started not just by refugees, by religious refugees. The Puritans, why'd they come to America? Because they were being persecuted in Britain along religious lines.
Yeah.
So
what you're saying is that they were the Daesh of that time, and they came here.
Well, they weren't. I don't know if they were the Daesh of
kidding.
that time, but they were definitely coming here from religious persecution. That's why they were fleeing Britain. So if you're a descendant of them and you think those people don't belong here, maybe you should get the fuck out.
I love, by the way, you have fucking idiotic just middling consensus building quislings like Jeb Bush, who his one was always okay. Jeb Bush, by the way, isn't he like that? He's just the desperation that comes off of that guy. Just, oh God! And it almost seems like I have a friend of mine that always seems like, it doesn't even look like he really wants to be president. He's just kind of doing it because he doesn't know what else to do. But he's at the same time
trying who else is going to give me a job?
Just desperately trying to get everyone's acceptance. And his whole thing in the last week or so was, we could take Syrian refugees if they prove they're Christian.
Jeb.
And so some reporter, there was a clip, you can look it up, of him standing in front of a brick wall somewhere outside, and he's got the circle of reporters around him, and someone finally lobs him the question, okay, but how did someone actually prove that they're Christian?
Oh.
And he's like,
crap.
And he's like, you see the kind of the glazed look come over his face, oh shit, no one actually, I didn't think anyone would ask me that. Okay,
I thought we were going to talk about Pokey, my pet turtle.
Okay, what's an answer? Okay, what would my brother do? Shit, he would just look stupid and wear a cowboy hat. Okay, what else should I?
What would my dad do?
And then he comes out with, I just think he can. I just think he can prove it. And there was a moment of everybody just kind of, did you really just fucking say that? Yeah, this is what we're dealing with on that side. I mean, the amount of ignorance is stunning.
And then didn't Donald Trump say he wanted ID badges for Muslims?
Yeah, I know. Here's a good idea. What we do is we take this, we make a tattoo right on their arm.
Yeah, numbers.
Oh, wait a minute.
Numbers. We put a number on every refugee. Yeah,
has that been done before?
I like that.
I think that's been done before. Yeah. It's the same shit. People were saying the same things about when the Irish were coming over, and the Italians were coming over, and the Chinese were coming over. It's always the same, but those people, don't assimilate our values, don't speak our language. No, it's the same bullshit, just ignorant. It's amazing to me how the tribalism of, let's say, early humans still lives, and it's just dressed up in this supposedly intellectual, it's just fucking biologic bullshit, really.
There's a little more to this, but first, I'd like for you to answer the question I asked you, Joe. When you talk about whether or not they need these handouts, Why didn't the Italians and the Jews and the Irish and the Chinese and the Japanese
Didn't
need
they
them
just
in the
help each
19th
other?
century? Well, they did help each other, but
Isn't that the
the
answer?
immigrants and the refugees help each other too. One doesn't.
I would
negate
argue
the
they
other.
did. They might have done better if they had them.
Okay. My argument, from a macroeconomic point of view,
Because they lived horribly for a while, didn't they?
but yes, but again, you have to put that in context. Oh, well, they didn't have plumbing and electricity. Nobody had it. It was the 1850s.
Well, I didn't even mean like that. But, I mean, they worked the shittiest jobs, you know, the whole thing.
That's
Generation
what
did.
you have to do when you first come to this country. My parents both had masters, and that's what they started out as doing. I don't see a problem with that. As long as you're not
But they
stuck
got help,
there.
too.
As long as you're not stuck there. Right, but they didn't have, the people coming in the 1850s didn't have masters.
Well,
There's a difference.
I don't know. My answer is it's
Okay.
not a theory thing for me. It's like more of an American ideal thing.
Okay, and I do see what you're saying. Like I said, if anyone deserves these handouts, it's the refugees. It's just that the government sucks at giving them out. My suggestion, well, for one, my theory is that macroeconomically, if you look at the modern economy versus the mid-19th century, not the Gilded Age, but the mid-19th century, the inequity is actually way more now than it was then. You want to talk about them living shitty lives?
Well,
Inequity, we are matching the records. We haven't set a new record yet. You know, we can pat ourselves on the back. Things aren't worse than they were in 1900, but they're just about as bad.
they've gotten worse than the 50s.
Which is just, I mean, this
is...
is, as a social worker and knowing the history of that time very, very well, that's just mind-boggling, and it's just, we should be ashamed as a country.
Did you see, by the way...
inequity. And I'm not doing the Bernie Sanders thing. I'm not proposing those solutions.
I am.
One does not, well, you are, but one does not negate that doesn't negate that we have the same problem statement.
Well, no.
This is
and he would admit it. He uses that in his stump speech of how shitty things have gotten, and he's not wrong.
And it's
one thing Hannity can lob at Obama, and he does, even though he doesn't want to do anything about it, is, oh, well, it's gotten worse under Obama. And he lists off, so many people in poverty, so many people in blah, blah, blah.
It has.
It has.
But, well, it didn't start under Obama.
It's not that he's doing, it's not because of Obama's policies. I mean, it's more of just, it's the trajectory of where we're going.
Obama hasn't done shit that he promised to do that's supposed to help. And a lot of that has to do, we're going to veer off a little bit, with corporate subsidies. You know, you always hear liberals complain about libertarians, we always say corporatism is not capitalism, but it can't be anything else. But no, corporatism is quantitative. You can have more or less of it. And we've never had this much of it, except in the Gilded Age, where literally the government was owned by the corporations. Both parties, there wasn't like one party that was openly corporate and the other one that was pretending to be of the people. Who needs that?
Looking at the candidates, I can't see how you could deny, that Hillary is probably the most corporate candidate out there.
Absolutely.
And she's supposed to
Except maybe Jeb, but nobody
ideals.
Right, but nobody cares about him.
Yeah.
He's stupid. But right, absolutely. The amount of it's not even always about money in direct subsidies. It's about shielding these corporations from competition and giving them bailouts, giving them just basically the inability to fail, and then wondering why the economy is not going back up.
That's the one thing that libertarians could march arm in arm with people like me in electing Bernie and bust these motherfuckers up now, because it's worse now than it was then.
And Bernie Sanders, he talks about this in the debates where he talks about what percentage of the banking sector is now controlled by the 6 largest Wall Street banks, and it's gone up like 15% since the crash in 2007.
Worse, yeah.
You think maybe we shouldn't be rewarding those guys with more control of the banking sector?
Not only did none of them see the inside of a jail cell, right, they're richer and more consolidated than ever. Anyways.
Right, so...
Did you hear, speaking of refugees, the idiot he was the mayor of Roanoke, Virginia, he mentioned in a complimentary way how, we dealt with the Japanese threat in World War II by putting them in camps. Why can't we just do that?
We dealt with the threat. Wow.
Let me repeat this again for those of you who might have missed what I just said. He cited the forced internment of hundreds of thousands of Japanese people in good standing who were citizens. A lot of them were born here.
Yeah, they were like third generation.
Never been to Japan, blah, blah, blah. They just kicked them out of their houses, trucked them into the middle of the godforsaken desert. If you want to drive to some of these campsites, holy shit. Like, there's a godforsaken highway in Arizona that's between 8 and 10 that you drive to get if you want to go to Phoenix through the front way. And you go right by one of these campsites. It's scorching, sheety, dusty fucking desert. There's nothing out there. That's where they were. Just because. And this guy's going, hey, that was a good idea. You guys like FDR, right? this is where we are with this shit in some cases.
Nothing's changed. Yeah.
No,
So,
it's amazing to me.
But where I was going back to the economic side of things, in the 1840s, 1850s, some of the refugees, unofficial refugees that I'm talking about, and even, 1860s, 1870s, you really did not have that amount of economic disparity. And, I don't like to romanticize about pre-Civil War America because there's a lot of things wrong with it. There's obviously slavery and there's racism and there's
slavery. Yeah,
there's a lot of things wrong with that America. I'm not the kind of libertarian who says, "Oh, we just need to go back to that," because no, there's a lot of issues with it. But one thing, again, look this up. Quote me on this. You did not have the same amount of economic disparity. So when you came here as a refugee, now granted you're a refugee and immigrant, you're a free man, you're not a slave, okay, we're not worried about that. But you came into the North, you came into Boston, New York, those cities, literally with the clothes on your back. You didn't have as steep or as tall of a mountain to climb. You could get a shit job, earning a shit wage, and your family is sleeping on the floor of some dormitory with 100 other families, and there's everybody in there, child molesters, criminals. I mean, nobody vetted the refugees in those days, not in any reasonable way, because you couldn't. Nobody even had papers. Where does the slur "wop" for Italians come from?
Papers,
without papers,
exactly.
right? And within a year or two, you could afford, if you weren't a drunk and if you weren't a loser and you actually just worked. You didn't have to be anything special. You just got a job and you worked by yourself. Your wife didn't work. She stayed at that place and took care of the kids, right? Within a couple of years, you could buy land. You could start a farm. You could start, if you're a merchant, you could start some kind of trade. You could actually make it. That whole American dream thing, this is where it came from.
That's why a lot of, farmers, and there's a lot of, German and Swedish, and there's ethnic groups in the Midwest for that reason, right? They homesteaded and...
Right. A lot of people moved west for that reason.
Was a government program. But anyway.
I wouldn't call
I won't bust you too hard on that one.
Hold on. It wasn't a
Homestead Act and all that. It wasn't a free land, basically?
Right, but that land didn't belong to anyone. They just said,
it belonged to the Native Americans, but... whatever.
It really didn't, because there weren't any there by this point. No, let's be accurate,
they already were
please.
Kicked out
right, they actually mostly died off before the Puritans landed. There was huge right. I mean, there was genuinely a lot of empty land. Not all of it, but a lot of it. So you talk about the Homestead Act, you talk about land, but if you look at today, and I just drove through Arizona a few months ago, there's still a shit ton of empty land in this country. You could still...
Is it land you want? That's the question.
That wasn't land you wanted either. This continent is very rough.
I guess in Kansas, you didn't really...
Right. This continent is very rough. It's really not all that... conducive to agriculture. But I mean, I don't think you'd start a farm anyway. All I'm saying is we have plenty of resources here, people. That's not the problem. The problem is these odds being stacked against from the day that you get off the plane, even as a refugee, and then the government coming in and saying, well, we created this problem, so here's a handout to fix it. And in my opinion, this is why handouts don't work in general. It's really not that different from serfdom, or even from slavery. Here's something for you, but you can't leave. You have to stay where we put you in subsidized housing. And you have to let us know about everything you do, all the money you make. But otherwise, your children might starve. You have enough people like that. It's really a very difficult system to break. And what's worse, a lot of these handouts, and this is actually mostly an American thing, which again it's a shameful thing for us as a country. I'm glad we're not socialist, but this is not any better. And that's the fact that a lot of these handouts are actually corporate subsidies. When you give out Section 8 vouchers or any kind of affordable housing vouchers, who owns that housing? Private corporations that were subsidized to build it. Developers. When you get food stamps, where do you buy the food?
And we've talked about that
from
program.
From large federally subsidized agricultural corporations. And then we wonder where this inequity comes from. Well, if I'm a small business owner of any kind, if I'm a small landlord with a small apartment complex, if I'm a farmer, how am I supposed to compete with those assholes?
Yeah, usually you have to go to the supermarket with your food stamp card. We've talked about
that,
this too.
And again, these federal programs, the bureaucracy, if you're as a provider, even though most of the providers are private, as a provider, it's extremely difficult to qualify.
I thought it was interesting to kind of branch out this topic of refugees. France had agreed to take 50,000 Syrians before Paris happened. And then Hollande afterward made a big deal about, you know what, we're still doing it. Some people were obviously like, whoa, what an idiot. And some people were like, okay, well, good for them. They're keeping their promises. They're not reacting with fear. But I guess then the question is, are they doing this completely in the right way? Maybe they should look at how they're doing it, because they have totally been at the segregationist model thus far, if I'm not mistaken. And
they're way worse than we are.
If one of them was a guy who snuck in as a refugee, the rest of them were all official carded French citizens that lived in some of these areas.
Most of them were either French or Belgian.
Born. Yeah.
Born. Natural born
not
citizens.
Refugee born, yeah.
What you gonna do about those, Donald?
Yeah, I know. Exactly. And, it's just, I don't know. It's difficult to respond to this because there's so much just rhetoric, it seems like, flying around that's untested, untalked about. Okay. So much just sheer bullshit. Like, using the example of Donald fucking just... we discussed this off the show. This guy finds new and better ways to make a complete and total ass of himself, followed in short order by the idiots that cheer for him at every one of his fucking rallies, going, "Rrr!" for the bleatings and ramblings of a complete and total lying moron. I mean, this thousands of Muslims cheering in the street in New Jersey when the towers fell. It didn't happen, okay? It didn't happen. Spoiler alert, it didn't happen. And then he tried to have to panic Google some kind of source to back his bullshit up, and the best he could come up with was one story of a guy who then he made fun of for being disabled later on, who he even was saying, that's not what I even said at all, which said, maybe there were reports filed to police to investigate FBI, an instance of maybe it happened at all. Just... Can't people fucking think for one goddamn minute? Okay, think back, people, a little bit. Just a little bit. Do you remember that happening? Just put yourself back there. Okay, the towers are falling. What are you seeing on TV? Are you seeing Muslims in America and Patterson, New Jersey cheering in the streets? I don't remember seeing that. Maybe he was watching different networks.
The mainstream media wouldn't show you that because they're liberal.
And not to mention, and that's the thing. We've gotten to the point now where because they won't show a thing that doesn't exist, that then feeds their conspiracy theory. Well, because they're not showing it, that means that they're trying to hide it from you. This is Alex Jones level bullshit now that we're dealing with in mainstream American politics.
Didn't I predict that was going to start happening a couple of years ago? Right, I was actually arguing with a couple of people on our Facebook feed, and this is just it's
like the Jade Helm thing. We should have known when that happened. We should have known how this election season was going to go. And you know what? I missed it.
Joe,
I fucking missed it.
I said we crossed a terrible threshold as a country. Crap. Did I not? That's it. We're done.
Obama had to talk about it in a press conference. He actually had to go on TV and go, what are you guys talking about?
Yeah,
It didn't deserve the time it takes to fucking open a stick of gum to talk about. It was completely made up cuckoo bird bullshit.
You remember when the Boston Marathon bombing happened?
Yeah.
And the Boston police chief, there were people throwing questions at him about, well, wasn't this a false flag?
It was one moron. It was one loud moron. Yeah, from InfoWars going, what are you responding? What are you hiding? What are you hiding?
And literally, he'd look at her.
Not hiding anything.
And he'd look at her and he'd say, no. Next question.
Yeah, that was the best one.
That is all the response they deserve. Because arguing with these guys...
Stop.
It's like arguing with the guy dancing on the street corner in his underwear over his pants saying the world's going to end in 5 minutes. That's the level of reason and logic that you're getting there. It's impossible. I can convince anyone.
Look, there's a street light out there. Why don't we go explain to that street light how Jade Helm wasn't a,
Basically. Yeah. So, I was actually arguing with a couple morons. Actually, this wasn't a couple. It was actually a group of them. And this is... Interestingly enough, and this is just, it's really sad to me, in a Rand Paul group. This is why libertarians aren't making headway, because these nutters have just completely taken over the movement.
They suck all the oxygen out of the room. Yeah.
Because they're loud and they're just unamenable to logic, and it's like forcibly no, just shut up. No, shut up.
You're restricting my free speech. You can't shut me.
I will literally step on their throats, because it's just no. There's a point where if you're spamming out and drowning out everyone else, it's not free speech anymore. It's not that different from yelling fire in a crowded theater. But what they were trying to tell me, this is a little bit off topic, was that the U.S. is supporting Daesh.
The witches?
The U.S.
is
supporting
I think I saw some picture.
Daesh. That's a new thing.
The internet loves to make pictures, and it was Netanyahu with puppet strings with ISIS and like a couple of things, and then it had like a U.S. flag and an Israel flag.
And was the lizard? Did the lizard alien have the puppet
this
strings
is what
on
we're
that?
dealing with. Yeah, I've seen that.
This shit is really becoming mainstream, but specifically with Daesh. And of course, my response is very simple: prove it. Evidence, please, is happening. Well, look, Al Qaeda. I'm like, no. I know we made Al Qaeda. I didn't ask you about Al Qaeda. Daesh. Next. Well, look, they have our weapons. Look, here's a picture of a Daesh weapon with a U.S. serial number. I'm like, yeah.
They took over cities in Iraq where we had weapons caches.
It's not just Iraq.
We knew that.
Area is just, it's saturated with U.S. weapons and U.S. equipment because during the Iraq War...
We've been there for 14 years.
Right. We've been there for a lot longer than that. And the Iraq War...
Like directly for 14 years.
And Turkey. Yeah. The Turkish stuff falls into their hands too, and that's a NATO country.
Which
and
is
we
also
make all
U.S.
the weapons, and Israeli stuff.
Our weapons come in many colors, many different designs.
Pretty soon, the whole world's just going to have our shit. We're like the world's weapon dealers.
Come to the United States, where you can buy your assault rifles branded in the flag of your choice. Turkey, Syria,
rifles.
Daesh, Iraq.
If only it were assault rifles, Joe. Right. But anyway, what I'm saying is, so I told him that, and these guys they have no evidence for their claims. None. But they're completely convinced that they're right. The thing is, you cannot prove that something didn't happen. This is Logic 101. So if they start with the mentality that until you can prove that it didn't happen, I'm going to believe it did, that's it. That right there, folks, by the way, that's called schizophrenia.
Right.
Just as a social worker, I'm going to inform you right now. That right there is the basis for psychosis. Is the burden of proof. You can't prove
there's not elves in my walls.
Yes, therefore there's probably elves in my walls, and I'm going to act as if there are elves in my walls. That shit will get you under the bridge very, very quickly.
It's called a mental illness. Go seek help, please.
Yes, and this is now becoming widespread. This is becoming an accepted way of thinking.
Here's the problem, and I think this speaks to what Neurotoxin here was talking about last show, about breaking people in their way of thinking when it needs to happen. Where this whole thing of like, I guess the idea of, and I'm talking about old school South Park, where they used to like go, oh, well, there's this side and there's this side, and the truth is somewhere in the middle. You know what? There's some issues. It's not like that, okay? Not everything has well, you have a point, but you have a point, and well, let's just agree to disagree. No. Okay? No. Some things, like the elves in the walls, you just say, no, it's not a thing. Next question, please.
Pretty much.
You move on. Some people don't deserve your acknowledgement, even to the point of taking them seriously enough to even respond to their crap. When it's
Joe,
that poorly based.
Bring up a topic that's been on this show a lot, and that we used to talk about a lot, and maybe it's time to talk about it again. That's a topic of compromise. And this is why, even in political terms in general, not just on refugees, I'm not a big fan of compromise. Because it's like, who was the comedian that said, I've got a really bad idea. Louis Black. Yeah. And I can make it so much shittier. This is what happens a lot, and it's not just a partisan thing. You have people with really bad ideas on both sides, and the middle is not necessarily better than either one of them. You really need ideas.
Look at Jeb for proof of this.
Right. Yeah, that is a centrist candidate. Did you ever think we talk about Jeb Bush as a centrist, by the way? Wow. What have we come to as a country?
Oh, my God.
But... yeah. We're doing it, right? I mean, Donald Trump, Bernie Sanders.
And yet he is. He's in the mushy middle.
He is.
What is he but the mitt of this race?
Right. But you really need ideas based on some kind of reasonable factual foundation. Otherwise, you end up back in the Dark Ages, where you're drilling holes in people's heads to let out the evil spirits because it just seems obvious. Well, his head hurts and he's got a fever, so if we open up his head, we're going to let out the spirit. And you try to tell him, microorganisms, get out of here. It's just, this is
witch talk. Yeah,
right,
exactly.
This is where, and then they threaten you. This is what we're degenerating to, really, as a global community. It's very scary. The last Dark Ages happened after the Roman Empire, and they understood science and medicine a lot better than people in the 800 BC. Just saying, just throwing that out there. Don't think it can't happen just because we're not there. And this is exactly how it happens: is people without educations, without a logical foundation, that want to be right, that want to participate, start being treated the same way as people who have the logic and the facts and the expertise. Now, call me an elitist, but to me this is very scary, and this is why I'm very wary of complete democracy. This is why I'm very wary of unchecked majority rule. This is why I'm very much in favor of constitutional limitations. Because at some point, just because a lot of people think it, you have to acknowledge, no, it's still bullshit.
I think that it says a lot when you have a businessman who's never held public office and a neurosurgeon who spent the last 30 years closed off in academia, both thinking that they can navigate the waters and then be in charge of one of the most complicated republics on the planet simply because they know nothing about the job they want.
Oh, that's what makes them qualified, right?
And that's an interesting thing where we're jumping completely to that. It's like, I understand the notion of, hey, let's get a guy who's not maybe bought and sold, bought off by the corporations, who isn't a whore already. Then again, you can have that in Bernie, and he's been in the government for a long time.
Right, that one is
prove
not
he's a whore. Please do.
He's not.
Anyway,
I can't agree with him, but he's not.
That idea that you need to elect an idiot or a complete, nincompoop on public policy like Carson to get that, it's insanity. And this whole, you see this in the electorate where the fact that someone is simple. I'm not shitting on small towns, but this idea that, because I don't know anything about big city life, about the rest of the world, I don't know shit about different countries, I don't want to educate myself, that is a point of pride and indicative that you're just right because you have simple homespun knowledge. Now, what are you fucking talking about? This is like, Italian villagers telling Galileo he was wrong. Well, I just know. No, you don't. You
look at the sun. It comes
just
up
look
and
at it.
Sets back down. So there's no
what
way.
What more proof do I need?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Whereas this guy is measuring things. He's looking. He's studying. He's actually making
calculating
actual determination.
You actually learn in psychology and developmental psychology that you have, and this is not talking about people who are cognitively impaired, by the way, to make that clear, that you have a certain demographic of children, like around late elementary school age, like 4th, 5th, 6th grade, who actually lack the insight to understand that they're fucking up. And these are usually kids from, from abusive homes that have not grasped the basics of, reading, writing, arithmetic when they were in the lower grades of elementary school. So now, some kid stands up and gives an answer that's right, and this kid has a different answer, and, they're basically held accountable. No, Johnny, that's wrong. And, they're a bully, they're pissed off, and they start bullying that kid because they think their answer was right. And they actually lack the insight to understand that their answer is wrong. And yeah, you're going to have those kids, and those kids are 5th graders, they need help. But that's essentially what Donald Trump is.
Yeah.
He's that kid with a trust fund.
With a trust fund and a private jet and a Sikorsky helicopter.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's who the country is slowly but surely becoming run by. It's just this complete detachment from objective, from objective science. And again, it comes back to something you said earlier that I really wanted to address, Joe, was you look at the refugees, and you said this more about France, but about the United States. Maybe we need to look at how. It's not so much the problem that we take them or we don't take them. It's what do we do with them when they get here, which I think is a huge theme of this show. But that right there, that question is sacrilege. We never get to that question.
No.
When is the last time someone asked, maybe we need to revamp how this program works?
It's whether or not they're all even allowed. Actually, and incidentally, if you want a kind of a detailed analysis, kind of run through of the process of vetting, John Oliver, on his last show, did a pretty good rundown of the whole thing. Yes. It involves 7 agencies. 7. And that's before the Republicans wanted to pass laws to make it like 9 or 10. I mean, it's nuts.
These are the same Republicans talking about how we need to cut down government and
right.
But
small
not
government Republicans, right? Yeah.
Are you kidding me?
Right. Yeah. And so, okay, yeah, we need more government, whereas the TSA misses 95% of the things. I was talking about that with a relative of mine at Thanksgiving. She travels for work all the time. She accidentally packed a box cutter in her suitcase. She didn't even know it was there. She thought she packed, she didn't know it was in her carry-on, is what it was.
Right, I was going to say, a suitcase, what do you do?
She didn't know, and the reason why, she was going to a trade show, and she had to unbox a bunch of shit when she got there. So she just, I had it, I'm just throwing it in there so I have it when I need it. She didn't realize until she got to where she was going. She opened up her bag, started unpacking her shit. Where did I put that? It's in my carry-on? And I'm not in a holding cell right now? Yeah, 9/11. That's all they needed was the box cutters. I mean, obviously we have reinforced cockpit doors now. We didn't then, but
and guys with guns.
The point is,
plane, but
we do this a lot in this country. We have a debate, or sometimes we don't have a debate, and we just throw money at something. In this case, it was, oh, 9/11 happened, so we got to just throw money at something to not make it happen again, even though a lot of people go, I have the 9/11 plan right over here in my idea. And it reminds me of in Fahrenheit 9/11, I know you hate this movie, but do you remember all the profiteering morons on a smaller scale that were trying to make money off the fact that 9/11 happened? And Michael Moore showed one in Fahrenheit 9/11 where it was a guy who was trying to hawk parachutes for high-rise office workers.
I do not recall this.
And he was like, "Oh yeah," it was on some local news channel where he's like,
and
it's easy to put on.
Jump out the window.
Yeah, it's easy to put on, and he's
wow.
showing, and he's like fumbling with it, and it's not easy to put on at all. There was a lot of because why? Because when people are afraid and there's something going on, they're gullible and they're easily duped. More so, they're not thinking with this brain; they're thinking with the lizard brain, of survival.
Yeah, but
and a snake oil merchant that comes out of the woodwork all of a sudden looks legitimate.
Well, you want to talk about snake oil merchants? Okay, on that note, there's that documentary now about the Iraq War. I forget the name of the guy. You can look it up, and we can certainly provide it for you on the website. But who was talking about how just the amount of equipment, and not only military equipment. Yeah. Yes. Not just military equipment.
No.
Trucks, construction equipment that just was brought into Iraq, and literally it was either destroyed or given away as soon as it got there because look, it doesn't meet this one specification. Let's order more. And literally the military and the occupiers were told to do that. They had a policy of doing that because it was just a profit train for the contractors, for the federal government.
That's how you get $48 million gas stations in Afghanistan.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So when you have this grip of fear from something like 9/11, this is what's going to happen.
No good crisis go to waste, they say.
Right. Never let a crisis
hawk
go
our
to
cheesy
waste.
wares.
Right. And honestly, and I know there's people that are going to get mad, and I don't care. I totally see the similarity between George W. and Donald Trump. I mean,
in that regard,
George W. was a little more appropriate. Okay,
who better than explain snake oil sales to the America than Donald fucking Trump?
Oh, yeah.
Why do you think he's the candidate of the moron class right now? Because no one I know of, even conservative people who I don't agree with most of the time, they hate Trump because they see what he is. He's a trailer park denizen's ideal of a rich American hero who can show us the way. It's like the picture on Facebook. That shows his gilded fucking house. This guy thinks you earn too much money. It's like the hypocrisy. But what has he done? He's made himself a brand, and he's put himself in that position of I'm what every American wants to be. And so that's the picture they have in their head. So then
I don't want to be him. I mean,
all he had to do was hit a comma to that sentence that he's built over the years ago, and now I want to be your president. That's all he had to do. That's why he's in the lead.
More or less. But what I'm saying more about, like you said, you're talking about, fear-driven profit. And this is a huge issue. This is why, honestly, Joe is hitting on just the core of my distrust and just my skepticism about government, especially government the size of the United States. We have to remember, we're the third largest country in the world. And the richest. So when we talk about the amount of resources and the amount of organization that our government requires, it really is number one. I'm not sure if China, that might be the only difference. But if you look at the number of people in China versus the number of people in the United States, that's not really competition. Even these countries we talk about where shit is not working appropriately, Britain, France, we've argued about this a lot on this show. They are 1/5, 1/6 the size of the United States. They're the size of California, and even California isn't working that well. But compared to the federal government, we're prosperous over here, right? This is a huge problem. Solving something like national security with the TSA or the vetting refugees at that level is never going to work because you have so many interests that have to come together and they all have to be represented in all their psychoses, all their special interests, all their beliefs have to all come together and come to a compromise on something as delicate and specific as how do we vet 10,000 refugees coming into this country. That's like if I want to go and buy a dozen eggs at the grocery store this morning or today. And I spend 6 hours online doing research on eggs just for that decision. That's how our federal government works. And when I make the decision, I'm not even making that decision because I actually found the eggs I want. It's all the information I get is completely jaded, completely biased. Everyone's bringing to the table people that are with them. So I'm still highly unlikely to make the right decision. Actually, the more money I put into the research, the more time, the less likely I am to make the right decision. This is my problem with the federal government, more so than anything else. And corruption is not much more than an extension of this. Right?
I guess so.
Corporatism, okay, you want to talk about corporatism. Honestly, no one makes this connection, but I feel like the return of corporatism in the modern age really is a byproduct of the Iraq War. Well, the Iraq and
completely.
Afghanistan. I mean,
Very corporate war.
right.
Not corporate interests.
A lot of people didn't think this could happen in the modern age. I mean, we already had the internet by the time 9/11 happened. It wasn't the internet of today, but it was there. You would think people had enough information that no government would risk going into Iraq because it was so pointless. There was nothing related to 9/11 was even in Iraq.
People knew because there were massive worldwide protests against it, but it didn't matter.
Taking down Saddam, we addressed this on the last show, is what allowed Al-Qaeda and Daesh to even plant their feet in Iraq because Saddam Hussein would have just taken those guys by the balls, lined them up against the wall, and executed them. As much as a psychopath and an evil, crazy dictator that he was, he did not tolerate Islamists. They were his number one enemy. Osama bin Laden, in the first Gulf War in the late 80s, early 90s, actually offered the U.S. that he would go take out Saddam. He was in Saudi Arabia at that point, under the condition that we do not put troops on the ground. Back then, he was our friend. That was right after Afghanistan. I know this is very inconvenient to a lot of you conservatives, but folks, it's reality.
Was our friend at one point too.
Yeah, you see how it worked, right? We're sicking these guys on each other.
Right. And it's like, and this is the thing, and Rand has mentioned this a little, Ron has mentioned it more. Just stop meddling in these countries, for God's sakes. When does it ever turn out well in the end for us? Okay, so seriously.
Maybe this is something that wasn't planned, but something I do want to talk about a little bit, this is related, is the current conflict with my homeland, where we make the 98% alcohol because vodka is nothing.
We are getting long in the tooth, but we should mention this whole thing with Turkey and Russia and the shot down plane. This was bound to happen, by the way. I kind of concernedly texted my friend here about this when it happened because of his kind of,
personal
specific knowledge
yeah.
and especially of the historical context. These two countries, they've done business with each other, but they don't politically like each other very much, and they have sort of a kind of a checkered past, don't they?
The Mongol Empire and the Ottoman Empire, where was that shit?
Yeah.
They are ancient enemies. I mean, this is a conflict that goes back 800 years. There are lands that continue to be disputed. There's actually a Russian comedian that spoke over the weekend about how Turkey should lay a claim to the Crimea.
Yeah,
because there was a point where that was part of the Ottoman Empire. It's actually their land, not Russia's or the Ukraine's. It's not. I'm just saying this is what's going to happen.
If we're talking about going back into, it's traditionally not. Well, actually, before it was actually that, motherfucker.
It was the Crimean Empire.
How far back do you want to go?
Exactly. Anytime you have land disputes, you have to bring this up. I mean, we are on Indian land here. But
it's, I think this was bound to happen, and more to the point, Putin wants this to happen.
I disagree completely.
Doesn't he?
I disagree completely.
Or at least he's been okay with poking NATO thus far.
Well,
fucking with Estonia, etc. It's completely to his pattern.
Yes, it's true that it's a pattern. Putin is a bully. He's a bully. He has the mindset of a bully.
He'll keep poking you until you do something bad.
He goes around pushing on people. I mean, literally. He went in to Syria because he wants to defend Assad, because that's one of the last, arguably the last Russian satellites in the world. Syria has the last Russian military base that's not on Russian soil now, with the Crimea being back part of Russia, the annexation. So I don't necessarily blame him for wanting to defend Assad, because Assad is fighting just a really weird patchwork of rebels. And yes, Al-Qaeda is in there, not Daesh, but Al-Qaeda, that are supported by the U.S. and Saudi Arabia and Turkey. So it's really kind of, we're back in the 1980s, we're back in Afghanistan with the Cold War, right, where we're supporting a bunch of really shady guys that hate us, but we're supporting them against a government that's inconvenient for us, and Russia's supporting the government. It's nothing new, folks. Come on. Some of you may not be old enough to remember, pick up a goddamn history book. This is normal. This is normal. The only reason he's bringing in his own warplanes is because he's fucked. Because that side does not have the resources and does not have the money, does not have the manpower to keep fighting NATO. Okay? He wants to bomb them. But here's what gets me about Putin, and this is very different about him from the Soviet dictators of that era, of the Cold War era. He will not admit that's what he's doing. He goes in there and we put the planes there and he said, we need to fight Daesh. We need a coalition against Daesh.
Even though he was bombing an area of Turkmen rebels.
Right. And as soon as they go there, 80% of the targets that have been hit by Putin have not been Daesh targets. You can
or either
hit,
our rebels or Turkey's rebels
well,
or
they're
Kurds,
all the same.
or,
Right. Here's the thing. Now, I feel like it's very hypocritical of us to support these assholes in a foreign country against the government of that country, even though the government is a bunch of autocratic assholes. And then point the finger at Russia and say, you can't bomb them.
They're just doing the same thing, right?
Come on. Really? Come on.
If the roles were reversed, we'd accuse them of supporting ISIS, because they would be,
Daesh. But we acknowledge what we're doing. Putin's whole claim to fame has been to point at grass and say, it's red! It's red!
He did that with Ukraine and Crimea. Oh, yes. The soldiers are just there on a weekend holiday
with tanks
in their tanks
and anti-aircraft missiles, yes,
and their guns, doing military things because that's what they like to do on vacation.
Well, we give them vodka, and this is what they do. Yeah, this is stupid. And all those nutters with their "I'm right until you prove me wrong" mentality take this shit that you just trace it right back to Russian government propaganda. And they claim, oh, look, he's bombing Daesh. Like, look where that plane went down and look where the fuck Daesh is. Did you fail geography in middle school? Come on. So this is the problem. I feel like Putin does this. This is my problem with him. It's not so much what he's doing. It's the rhetoric. It's the propaganda because it just completely destroys objectivity. So he finally poked the wrong guy. Erdogan and Putin are very, very similar. If you look at their politics...
Yeah, they don't really care for people criticizing them, for one thing.
There's that. But there's also the fact that Turkey pre-Erdogan, about 10, 15 years ago, was just completely this NATO puppet dictatorship, kind of like... You can compare it to some of the Central American dictatorships that we fed. They weren't very religious. They're actually pretty similar to the Shah in Iran. The Shah, not the religious. Not the Ayatollahs.
Right.
They're this just, nominally democratic junta, huge military establishment, no real democracy, relatively economically prosperous, no real social freedom, and massive, massive, massive ethnic discrimination against the Kurds. And then you had the PKK, which at the time was huge. It's a communist guerrilla fed by the USSR. This is just a brief lesson in Turkish history. Okay? Which is why this makes a very bad country to involve in this, because those tensions haven't gone anywhere.
No.
And Erdogan is kind of the Putin of that country. That junta went down because the Cold War was over and we didn't need him as much anymore. It's kind of a period of political turmoil, and Erdogan kind of rose up, getting everybody together. He brought the Islamists under him. He's tried to do things for the Kurds better than the previous junta did. He's got the left, the right. He's trying to be this everything man, but basically he's just consolidating power. So him and Putin, really, they're the same. They're very, very similar, politically, economically, everything. So Putin finally poked the wrong guy, and everyone's like, okay, boom! Just punched him in the mouth. And it proved what I've always said about Putin for the last 2.5 years, that as soon as someone punches him in the mouth, he's going to crawl into the corner and cry like a little bitch. And that's exactly what he's been doing. All you idiots out there, oh, Russia could take us. No, they couldn't. Do the math.
He basically has been outright lying and saying, oh, we warned in Turkey, they didn't warn us, blah, blah, blah. He's saying the grass is red.
Right, yeah.
Even though Turkey released to the news the tapes of them warning them, of them doing this. Like, it seems like, I don't know, and again, it's a dispute between two other countries. I don't want to, piss anyone off, I guess, but from what I've heard, from what has been reported, Turkey has proof.
They've shown objective evidence that this happened.
If you're saying the other thing, then show your evidence.
Yeah.
What's not okay, and obviously I'm gonna mention this too, is that when the pilots parachuted out, they were shot and killed, weren't they?
They were shot and killed by the rebels that they were trying to bomb.
By the rebels, right.
So, yeah, if you try to bomb people, when you get knocked out of your plane, they might want to shoot at you. Just, you're in a war.
Turkmen rebels, but yeah.
Right, they're rebels that are in Syria. They're not part of the Turkish government. They're being supported by Turkey, but everybody there is being supported by somebody. That's not...
it is a war zone, so...
Right.
But, a lot of people are making hay about that too on the Russian side. And it's like,
right. So my thing is this situation. I don't even know what to call it anymore, because, I mean, Syria is not really a country anymore, let's face it, neither is Iraq. It's not really the Middle East, it's more, I guess, the Tigris-Euphrates region, whatever you want to call it, the Fertile Crescent. That cannot end well. There's just no positive end for this in sight. Because... And it's not just Russia versus Turkey. Honestly, I'm making this promise right now. Nothing will come of this Russian-Turkey conflict because Turkey is just too powerful. They're a NATO member. Russia is not going to engage in further aggression. I'm glad it wasn't a Saudi. They'll Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, they won't make it.
I'm glad it wasn't Saudi Arabia that shot down one of the planes, because that can happen too, because those guys, the same guys Putin's bombing, they're on the other side too, over by the Saudi border. And Jordan and all that. And if that had happened, because Saudis are not a NATO member, and because the NATO has been having a lot of issues with the Saudis, and the Saudis, they went into Bahrain, and the U.S. wouldn't back them on that. There's been a lot of economic strife, and keep in mind, these are both oil countries, Russia, Saudi Arabia. They're both going to shit economically because of oil. They both have a lot of internal strife. I can just see those two countries, that being a catalyst for, okay, we're going to war. And of course, Iran's right there, and they go to war with Saudi Arabia too. There you go. World War III, folks. Right there. And then eventually we'll have to back Saudi Arabia. If that happens, NATO will have to back Saudi Arabia, because we can't just let Iran take down Saudi Arabia. Because Saudi Arabia has always been our
planted
boy.
Our side, yeah.
Right. Even though we don't like Saudi Arabia, but they're our jerks.
Right.
So
they have been traditional.
There's something vaguely familiar about all this. And there was a time.
That's what concerns me.
There was a time, this is a long time ago, it was over 100 years ago now, when the U.S. would stay out of these things. They would let the Russians and the Germans and the British and the French and the Ottoman Empire all eat each other over stupid territorial squabbles. Yeah. Meanwhile, we were over here building our factories, building up our economy, and yes, we were selling everyone weapons just like we do now. We were giving them credit. We were profiteering off the war, but we weren't dying in it. Now, you know who does that now, Joe? There's a country that does that. It starts with a C. You look at Libya. When Libya went to shit, there was one superpower, one giant country that stayed out of that conflict, stayed neutral, and that was China. And then after Gaddafi got taken down and everyone had their guys in there, Russia had their guys, we had our guys, the EU had their guys, Saudis had their guys, Iran had theirs. Like, God, this is why it's a clusterfuck. It's really not that different from Syria. It's just smaller. China was the one country that didn't get involved. And you know what they did when Gaddafi went down? They went in and bought everything.
Yeah, they did.
That is what the U.S. used to do. That's how we became a superpower, folks. In the 19th century, when all those French and Spanish and British colonies were dropping like flies in the Americas and they were going to shit, the U.S. would just stay out of nope. And then as soon as things would go to shit, okay, we're coming and buying everything. That is how you become a superpower. Now, I'm not one of these Republicans that goes, oh, China's a threat and they're going to take over, because that's not the case. I'm just talking about economic competition. If we look at, who is really our economic competition? It's not Russia. Are you fucking kidding me?
It's not Russia.
No economist can look at Russia with a straight face and say it's a superpower. And the reason for that is very simple. The inequity there is unmatched.
Oh, it's crazy.
Nigeria has less inequity than Russia.
There's some very rich Russian people. There are.
There's about 10.
In the world.
There's about 10.
Yeah.
And everyone else
that have mega super yachts,
power,
and tons of luxury cars.
Exactly.
And,
So this is the kind of thing. Russia's going to go to shit. They're not the problem. I read a lot of Russian news, dissident Russian news. I know what's really going on there. I know our friend Brian is going to probably win his bet, and Putin's not going to go down by the end of this year.
Looking like it.
Let me tell you, his days are numbered. That shit's not going to last much longer. The real threat to us, economically, not politically, not in a war, is China. Because that's the country constantly profiteering and sucking up all the resources as a result of the chaos that we, the U.S., first and foremost, are creating with all our meddling. And every candidate in this race, including Bernie Sanders, the only real outlier is Rand Paul, and he's not making any headway, is just consistently doubling down on this strategy. Well, we've meddled, so we need to meddle more.
He's been pulling back a little in recent weeks, actually. Bernie.
Well, Bernie.
A little bit.
Here's, I think, the difference between you and I on this, Joe. I don't know why we always end up talking about Bernie Sanders toward the end of the show, but this is not
Feel the burn.
Right. No, I'm going to say this show is not an advocacy show for Bernie Sanders, but I feel like when he talks about diplomacy, he talks about global institutions, because that's really always been his thing, which is a democratic socialist thing. I mean, it's consistent with European democratic socialists. Yeah, we need to involve the UN. We need to involve these global institutions, treaties, and all that. That shit doesn't work. Look at all the start and sort treaties with the USSR. And tell me if that shit was beneficial to us. The moment Ronald Reagan said, you know what, fuck you, the USSR went down. That is not the way to go. It's infinitely better than just randomly bombing countries for short-term profit. I'll give you that. But just because you're better at foreign policy than George W. Bush or Donald Trump doesn't make you good at foreign policy.
Well,
I mean, if you look at the conflict...
Those aren't high bars.
And again, this is... Right, exactly. This is my specialty, is international relations. If you look at foreign policy conflict history, through most of the 20th century, before, say, the 80s, the 90s, that was the conflict. So-called isolationism, but the real term for it is non-interventionism. I'd say Rand Paul is the last non-interventionism, versus globalist diplomacy and getting involved. Eisenhower had a non-interventionist foreign policy, and it almost worked. He almost strangled the USSR. They were on the verge of collapse.
His policy in Russia was detente, of just mutual kind of dialogue.
He had this
deterrence.
He had this advantage. Yeah. He went to Berlin in 1945, and he saw the Russian army roll in on tanks that were missing wheels, and soldiers marching in, starving and barefoot with guns. They're like beating the Germans to death with their guns because their guns don't work. I mean, these guys got iron resolve. I'll give my people that. But their military was just. If you look at the casualties, the USSR was like the only state that had a lot more civilian casualties than military casualties, because just starvation. He knew that country was a complete joke and they could not take the United States in a war. He knew that they would not stand a chance against NATO. It wasn't happening. Which is why his thing is just let them starve. Starve out the dictators, especially Stalin died in 1953. Starve out the dictators, it'll collapse, and then whoever takes over will deal with. And that was Reagan's policy. I'm not a huge fan of Reagan, but this is what he got right. That was his approach. He revived that approach after 30 years, and bam, 6 years later, no more USSR. It works. Non-interventionism works. When you start getting diplomatic, which is, the Kennedys and the Nixons and the Carters of that era, that was the diplomacy, and it's not really a partisan thing. The globalist diplomacy, and that's what Bernie Sanders is trying to do. It looks better, because look, we're being intellectuals, but you can't be an intellectual against a bully. You don't need to beat them up, but you can't give them what they want. They'll just use it. So now, sadly, non-interventionism has been replaced with the Donald Trump and George W. We'll kick all their asses. No, you won't. You won't.
Yeah.
You can kick a couple of their asses, but then what do? Then you own their asses. And their asses stink. I mean, look at Iraq. That's what we did in Iraq. And look what's happening
how well
there.
that turned out.
How well that worked. Right?
There's a lot of bullshit floating around. I think it's a good bullshit riddled note to wrap up on.
Right. So the show was meant to be about refugees, and I feel like we're 80% kept that promise to ourselves.
That's a good ratio.
So, something we talked about last show, and something we promised our listeners, and something I believe we will do, we just haven't gotten around to it yet, and this show I feel like led into it a little bit, but we need a lot more, is we may possibly be starting a separate franchise on mental health and social services surrounding the mental health system.
We seem to deal with so many of the mentally ill in our work here.
Well, I feel like...
I don't want to make that a joke.
Honestly, no, it's not funny, but it's true. I feel like mental illness is... And I understand I'm a professional with this, and Joe has had a tragic experience with it now. It's a very, very relevant topic for politics on a number of domains. Number one domain I feel that no one wants to touch is gun violence. Now, just because you acknowledge that gun violence is a huge problem does not mean you're a gun control advocate. I don't want to hear it. My worst enemy wouldn't call me a gun control advocate. But mental illness and just the disastrous system with which we deal with mental illness in this country, and Obamacare has not made it any better. In fact, I'm willing to venture that some of the uptick in just random violence by people who are clearly suffering from mental illness has been somewhat of a result just of the economic situation in general. People who cannot afford their medications. People who cannot get treatment. And Obamacare does not make it easier. It gives you a piece of paper that you're entitled to. It doesn't actually give you treatment. So the mental health system in this country and a lot of the social service systems that we've, well, not so much refugees, but a lot of the social service systems in general, very, very closely tied to it. If you look at, our social service systems, because a lot of them are federal, or at least federally granted, federally funded, they are very bureaucratically standardized. And two things that really, really, really don't stack up well is bureaucracy and mental illness. Because the mentally ill are incapable of going through a bureaucracy. I've seen this over and over and over again. You would think that a social service agency serving the homeless, serving people who are coming out of the prison system, and they're in recovery.
There's no help for them. Yeah.
Well, there is actually quite a bit of help for them, believe it or not. People who are recovering drug addicts, right? You would think, or even refugees for that matter, because a lot of them are torture survivors and all that. You would think that they would have an understanding of mental illness, because probably, venture a guess, a lot of people you're going to be dealing with just might have some issues you're going to come across. But no, these systems, and it's because of the politics of compromise that we talked about. These systems are just, if you can't fill out a form, and if you can't sit through and be coherent during a 2-hour interview, then you're basically not getting help. And if you are getting help, you're only getting enough help that we can put down on a piece of paper that we helped you, so that if you end up dead, we're not liable.
Right.
And I'm trying to keep this as unpolitical as I can. This is not helping the mentally ill. And it's becoming a huge problem. In fact, if you look at mental illness, we're not talking like full-blown schizophrenia, but if you look at mental illness, all it really is a deviation. It's an alternative way of looking at things. It's an outlier statistically. Most people who are mentally ill, and they're diagnosable, they're mentally ill, this is a real thing, can still lead fairly normal lives. What fucks with them, and our former guest Agent of Change would love what I'm saying here. What fucks with them is that they cannot live up to the bureaucratic standards that this world has set. It's very difficult for kids that are suffering from mental illness to go sit through 8 hours of school. And this is why we have to medicate them from when they're 7 years old. Oh, little Johnny, who's 7 years old, can't sit through 2 hours of class. I don't think I want to know a 7-year-old that can sit for 2 hours, do you? This is the kind of thing that the more bureaucratic standards you have, the more outliers you're going to have. People who are genuinely just completely belligerently psychotic make up maybe 1% of the population. We're not talking about them. We're talking about people who are suffering from some issues that they could lead fairly normal lives if we did not try to quote-unquote make them normal. And the system does this constantly. And honestly, this has been a huge issue for me as a social worker and as someone that works in this system, and a significant motivation for my political views. So that's kind of my take on it. We're not exactly sure how we're going to frame this yet, but I think that some of the explanations of the social service model in this country from this show have been a good lead into it. So that's all I've got. I'm Neurotoxin, and Joe will wrap up.
Yeah, awareness is definitely a big thing. So for Neurotoxin, I'm Joe Ryan. You'll be hearing from us more on that in future shows. We'll be keeping you posted on all that. Thank you for listening.